27 years ago, Tim Berners-Lee published his proposal for a World Wide Web, a space that many believed had the potential to unlock a new era of digital prosperity and empower millions of people to be part of a better economy. Today, I'll be joined by Jonathan Taplin, a man who's warning us not to sleep through our current technological revolution and whose recent book, Move Fast and Break Things, catalogues how some of our largest technology companies, Google, Amazon and Facebook, have cornered our culture and undermined democracy. My name is Seb and I'll be your host for this next 45 minutes. And you're at the DIF, the largest online festival of ideas that explores the question, what if we could redesign everything? I'll be in conversation with Jonathan over the next 45 minutes, as I said, and we really want your input and your questions and your feedback and your comments during that time. And there are really three main ways that you can get involved. One is by tweeting at us using #ThinkDiff. The second is by using the comment space on the page. It's a 1 or 2 click process to sign in, but you should see it just below the video embed on our session page on the DIF website. And the third one is using the YouTube live chat feature if you've made your way over to the YouTube channel. And if you send those through, I'll be feeding those through to Jonathan during the course of the next 45 minutes as we dig into his book and some of the big topics within it. But I want to start off, Jonathan, so thank you very much for being with us today, by asking you to tell us a little bit about your background, because the story of how you've actually ended up being a person who's writing a book about the world's largest technology companies perhaps isn't the traditional one.
Thanks, Seb. You know, I basically was lucky enough in 1965 when I was on my way to Princeton to go to the Newport Folk Festival. And that was the year that Bob Dylan decided to go electric. And so I got to meet his manager, Albert Grossman, and started working for Albert as a weekend job while I was at Princeton. And I managed some of the other bands that Albert had, like the Jim Kweskin Jug Band or Janis Joplin. But eventually I worked my way up to being the tour manager for the band. And I put a picture of the band up online here. And then Bob Dylan decided to come back, and we went actually to London and then to the Isle of Wight in 1969 to do a rather extraordinary concert at the Isle of Wight Music Festival. All the Beatles came to visit and were there at the festival. And so I spent the next 8 years in the music business, and then in the mid-70s, I came out to Los Angeles and met a young film editor named Marty Scorsese. And I kind of didn't know enough not to put my own money into making movies. And we made a movie called Mean Streets. And it turned out pretty well.
A few of our audience members may know that movie.
And so I did more movies with Marty. We made a movie called The Last Waltz, in which I brought the band and Marty together, and we did the final concert for the band, which is probably one of the great rock and roll movies. So the way that I came to this story from my music background was that Levon Helm, who was the guy in the back of that picture drinking a Coke, was the drummer and the lead singer of the band. Many of your audience probably heard The Wait or The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down. And Levon made a pretty good living. The band weren't as popular as Cream or the Rolling Stones in the late 60s, but they did well. And even though the band stopped recording in 1979 after we did The Last Waltz, the record royalties continued to pour in, because in the 80s, the CD came out, and so everybody kind of renewed their record collections. And that continued all the way up to about 2000, when Napster came online, the first big pirate site. And that disrupted everything, and it just so happened that Levon got throat cancer that same year. So his record royalties, which had been in the neighborhood of like $80,000 to $100,000 a year, just came to a halt because everybody could get it for free online. And so he didn't even have enough money to pay for his health care. And that seemed to me to be incredibly unfair because I could go on YouTube in, the mid 2000s and see maybe 3 million streams of The Wait having been streamed from YouTube. And of course, Levon didn't get any of that money. None of the band did. So I began to think about what had happened. And as you noted, that kind of took me back to the roots of the web and how Tim Berners-Lee and John Seeley Brown and Vince Cerf and all the people that I've been able to work with over the last 10 years had this very countercultural idea, and I put another slide up there, to decentralize the media system. In the late 60s, when the World Wide Web was invented, at least in the United States, there were like 3 television networks and 1 newspaper in any city, and that was the media. So an idea of an incredibly decentralized media system was really great. And of course, as I point out in this slide, it was paid for by the US government through a program called ARPANET, which was the Army's advanced research project. And that vision of a decentralized web worked out pretty well until the late 80s. And I put up another slide, when a group of libertarians came forward, led by Peter Thiel of PayPal and then Facebook fame, led by Larry Page, Jeff Bezos, and they had a very libertarian point of view. They believed, like Ayn Rand, that the great entrepreneur is always inhibited by democracy.
And for audience members who don't know, you're referring to people like Larry Page, sort of often associated as the founders of Silicon Valley, I guess, that kind of movement.
I mean, Thiel founded PayPal, Larry Page founded Google, Jeff Bezos founded Amazon, and they had rather radical ideas. I mean, there's a picture of what Thiel calls a seastead, which is the idea that you would set up your corporation on a platform in the middle of the ocean, out of the reach of any government. Because the whole idea was that, as Thiel said, I no longer believe that capitalism and democracy are compatible. And so he wanted to set up a business sector online that would have no regulation. And so out of PayPal came what we call now the PayPal Mafia, and it's his term, not mine. And you notice they're all men, and they are now running most of the companies in Silicon Valley with the same kind of libertarian ethos that Thiel said. The beginnings of that ethos in this next slide were that there should be no regulation of the internet. The internet businesses should pay no taxes. So Jeff Bezos at Amazon was able to sell books without paying sales taxes and managed, at least in the United States, to put about 4,000 independent bookstores out of business because they had to pay sales taxes. And that there should be no copyright. So, and we'll talk about this later, but YouTube is obviously a site with 1.5 billion users that has no respect for copyright whatsoever. No musician has any way to permanently get his content off of YouTube. And finally, he didn't believe there should be any competition.
Yeah, and I think that feels like an especially relevant topic, the bit about, I guess, no taxes in the context of the Paradise Papers, which were obviously released only a week ago, and the constant storylines that we hear about that kind of innovation. Obviously, some of those companies you've mentioned have been implicated in that scandal, for lack of a better word, around tax evasion. It's interesting. I mean, in the book you name Amazon, Google, and Facebook. Is it your proposition that those are the 3 largest culprits, or is there a larger section of that market that are responsible? Or is it that those are the 3 companies that you would highlight?
Well, those are the 3 monopolies. I just flipped to another slide. So 10 years ago, the largest corporations in the world were ExxonMobil, General Electric, and Citigroup. Today, the largest companies in the world are Apple, Google, which is called Alphabet, Microsoft, Amazon, and Facebook. Now, that's an extraordinarily rapid rise of these technology giants. And Apple is not a monopoly, and neither is Microsoft. They both compete in very crowded fields. For instance, the smartphone business, Google has the major market share, not Apple's iOS system. And the same with much of the software business that Microsoft, Apple is. But, you know, Google is a 88% market share in search advertising. Amazon has a 75% market share in the books business. Facebook, if you include Instagram and WhatsApp and Messenger, has about 75% of the mobile social market. So they're clearly monopolies. And the effect that they have on musicians, journalists, and everything is extraordinary. If you look at this next slide, this is a picture of the music business that from the day that Napster went online, as you can see, it's fallen by 71%, even though the green and orange represent new revenues that have come online from digital streaming. It's clear that it's nothing close to the business it used to be. And when you look at the newspaper business, it's even worse. Almost a fall of 80% from the day that Google went online. And so these businesses have cratered. There are 50% fewer people working as working journalists today than there were. And as far as musicians are concerned, you know, Jay-Z and Taylor Swift and Adele can really make a good living, but the average middle-class musician can't make a living off their work at all. And as this next slide shows, the revenues for the big giants, for Amazon, Google, and Facebook, went just the opposite direction. They went through the roof. And as Peter Thiel has said, competition is for losers. If you want to create and capture lasting value, you need to look to build a monopoly, which is what they did.
And I think something that's interesting to pick up on here is actually there's another story, a sort of narrative, I think, that exists in media, I guess, or in, you know, in society, that in many ways the digitization of music and film and media has been a massive success story because of the people, I guess, the ability for people to take part and to create very easily. And that's sort of quite pervasive, isn't it, that people can join in. And you're telling us sort of the other side of that, which is that not only you know, does that have a potentially harmful effect on people who are looking to make a living, and that's damaging to culture, but also that the benefit of that creativity is actually going into the hands of a very small number of people.
Yeah, because you think about what's happening in the streaming music business. Your viewers may think that Spotify is the largest streaming music player, but as this chart shows, YouTube is by far the largest streaming music player. It has almost 60% market share of just the streaming audio business. And all the others, Spotify, Tidal, Deezer, Radio, Rhapsody, Google Play, Beats, are crushed into the other, you know, 48%. So, but YouTube only puts in 11% of the revenue, as you can see from this slide, taking almost 60% of the market. So what does YouTube say to the musician? Your music is going to be on YouTube whether you want it to or not. And so what you have to decide as a musician is, do you want a little of our advertising revenue or none? And given that choice, a lot of people have opted to take a little advertising revenue. And when I say a little, I mean it's a little. If you think about a tune that's very popular that could get 1 million downloads on iTunes, that would make the musician or the record company about $900,000. But if you got 1 million streams on YouTube, you'd make $900. So that's the
difference.
Effect. That's the difference.
And I mean, I guess there's an economic and there's a very strong economic and business thing going on here, where, you know, as we've described, there's a disparity between the small marginalized monopolies at the top, able to extract so much value from this creativity. But I wondered, you know, as someone who was so involved in the music business, as someone who worked with a lot of musicians, I guess there's also a cultural damaging effect, and I think you talk a bit about that in your book, perhaps, that there's this sort of monopolization of creativity and music and culture as well, which is not beneficial to society.
Well, I mean, there's two ways to look at this. One of which is, you know, obviously in an age where so much music is streamed, the one thing record companies seem to get is a lot of data. The trouble with data is the data always looks backwards. And so then trying to decide the future on the basis of what was popular 3 months ago or 6 months ago seems to me to be a fool's game. I mean, Bob Dylan never thought about what was popular on the radio. It was just not even in his mindset. And quite frankly, I don't think the Beatles did either. And so this notion of, oh God, we've got all this data and now we can figure out exactly what the consumer wants is nonsense. It's crazy. And the second thing is, I would just think about YouTube as a video platform. You know, there's this wonderful theory called sometimes it's called the infinite monkey theory, and sometimes it's called the million monkey theorem. But basically the idea was, if you had 1 million monkeys and you gave them all typewriters and you had infinite amount of time, they would eventually create Hamlet, Shakespeare's greatest play. Just random, right? But that's kind of like YouTube. So YouTube gets 400 hours of video uploaded every minute of every day, every 365 days of the year. But where is the Shakespeare or the Francis Coppola or the Martin Scorsese that's emerged from that gigantic storm of content? It's not there. And so I don't know what exactly they think they're creating, but it's not art. I'll put it that way. It's PewDiePie watching someone play video games.
So there's the culture side of it, and then I guess there's this issue of monopolies. So in the UK, we do have a law against monopolies. I'm not sure that there's the same restrictions on the US, but I guess there's a sort of sense that you know, it's bad business to have in capitalism alone. I guess maybe it's a falsehood within capitalism, but our economies are somewhat based on the idea that it's bad to have these monopolies. And how do you assess that they have actually managed, how they have managed to emerge in the economic climate? Is it something to do with the digitization of them, the fact that they're sort of untrackable or unplaceable?
No, I think it's really more a matter of Thatcherism and Reaganism. In other words, that in the early 80s, this notion of the free market would always deliver the right solutions was kind of religion for both Thatcher and Reagan. And so essentially what they did was they told the regulators, stop regulating. The market will decide it. And, you know, there was in the US, there was a guy named Robert Bork, who very prominent lawyer, who wrote this book called The Antitrust Paradox. And they basically said the only thing you have to look at when two companies want to merge is, will prices go up? And if prices don't go up, then you should let it happen. So think about that in terms of, say, Amazon. Amazon has so much power that it can constantly force prices lower. So in that schematic, Amazon could be the only retailer in the world, and prices might not go up because it had so much power as a middleman to force everybody who's producing anything to lower their prices. Would that be good for society? I don't think so.
It's a fascinating perspective. And I guess in a broader theme at the Diff here, we're talking about this age of automation, this idea of, quite often in these sessions about age of automation as well, we're talking about robots and artificial intelligence and how those things can, in either a positive or negative way, disrupt society or people's lives or displace jobs. It was quite interesting that you had that graph up earlier that reflected on the impact on jobs in the journalist or newspaper industry. And I think something that interests me about there's a form of AI, a form of automation in the algorithms that govern these three big companies. I mean, they basically have very sophisticated automated systems that feed us information that make, well, I guess influence quite strongly the sort of decisions that we as people in the society make. I read something the other day about the way in which Facebook's news algorithms effectively during the US election fed each side of the debate, more information about what they already knew. So that idea of Tim Berners-Lee's idea of a World Wide Web that somehow enabled a new age of information, empowered more access to information, almost isn't working in any way. And I guess my question to you is, are we in this age of automation where in fact we don't need to be afraid of robots, but maybe we need to be afraid of companies that are controlled by people and the way in which automation is feeding us this dialogue or these narratives?
Well, look, this is a very big question. Let's take it piece by piece. Let's think about Facebook and the elections. I put up a slide which maybe you could show the audience. What happened in May of 2016 was that Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook, had been pounded by Fox News and Breitbart into removing the humans from the trending topics curation. In other words, before May 23rd of 2016, there were humans involved in the curation of what went to the top of the trending topics and thus what went to the top of your newsfeed. And Breitbart convinced Facebook to get rid of that. Now, whether Peter Thiel, who was a Trump delegate, was involved in that decision or not, I don't know. But what the result of it can be seen on this chart. So the day the red line goes straight until May 23rd, and then that's the fake news, and then it goes straight up right after that. So what happened? So because there were no humans involved anymore, you could, for instance, post something that says, the Pope endorsed Donald Trump. And if you hit it with enough bots, which obviously Cambridge Analytica had at their disposal, you could force it to the top of the trending topics at Facebook and to the top of Google's search algorithm relatively easily. And so the computer didn't know that the Pope didn't endorse Donald Trump, and there was no human in the loop to say, wait a minute, that's stupid, that didn't happen. So then it just became a matter of how do you play the algorithm? And obviously, both in the Brexit situation and in the American election, Cambridge Analytica was very good at playing the algorithm. So that to me seems to be a big problem. The second problem that I would suggest is linked into this idea of these companies' basic business is what I call surveillance capitalism. And they're interested in, I don't know if they're trying to sell these home speakers like the Alexa in the UK as much as they're selling them in the United States. But both Google, Facebook, and now Amazon are selling these what they call smart speakers. But what they really are is smart microphones that are always on in your house, collecting more data on you to sell you more stuff. So what we have to really ask ourselves is, where does this end up? And I would just look at this next slide, which is, you look in China, and Alibaba has a system called Sesame Social Credit. And what Sesame Social Credit is it overlays your credit score, that is, how well do you repay your credit cards and your bank loans, with your social media scores, which are collected by algorithms and artificial intelligence on every device that you use. And so, for instance, if you played video games for 7 hours yesterday, your social credit would go down because you were considered a slacker. If you happened to write something that was against the Chinese government on WeChat, your social credit score would go down because you'd be considered unpatriotic. If for some reason you jaywalked in Shanghai and one of those ubiquitous cameras that have facial detection systems built into them that are all over the streets in Shanghai, your social credit score would be gone down because you were considered a lawbreaker. Now, you'd think, well, why would anybody get onto that? Well, there are 200 million people who have subscribed to Sesame Social Credit. And 2 weeks ago at the Communist Party Congress, Xi Jinping said he thought every Chinese citizen should be on this system. So the possibility of enforcing conformity and ultimate social monitoring is already here, using the combination of social media plus artificial intelligence.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about what you just said, to me at least, is this idea of surveillance capitalism. Often we think of it as cameras, don't we? We think of it as people looking in on us. I guess Foucault's idea of the panopticon, where you're always being watched, but actually you can be just as much surveyed and watched by your data, by what you do and what you work, and that can be used to influence purchasing decisions, democratic decisions, a whole ream of things that perhaps we didn't even really know were valuable to us. We just took them for granted, and companies like the ones we've been talking about so far have found a way to turn that into massive value.
Well, I mean, obviously Google's location services, in which it tracks everywhere you go, every store you go into, and now they've bought all the purchasing information, which they will overlay with all that data. So it doesn't matter whether you buy it online or you buy it offline. Google knows everything you've done, and there's no really escaping that. It gives you a perfect profile. Now, they claim that that's anonymized. In other words, they only know you by some kind of IP address number, but that's nonsense because they've cross-referenced your phone IP address, your home computer IP address, your car device, and every other device that you have. So they have a perfect picture of your life.
Yeah, so Google knows everything about you, but there is some cause for hope, or at least I know in your book you do talk about some of the potential solutions and things that we can do differently, and I want to get to those shortly. I also want to get to our audience questions, which have been coming in, and I will encourage you to continue submitting those underneath the feed under the stream you're watching, or via Twitter using #ThinkDiff. But right now, I'd like to head over to my colleague, Leo, who's going to tell you something about the flavour of things that are going on at the Disruptive Innovation Festival over the next couple of days and couple of weeks.
Thanks, Seb. I won't keep you too long because this is really interesting stuff. And I just, like you just said, I just want to highlight a few sessions coming up later this week and give you a few reminders of what you can do in the diff. So tomorrow at 5 p.m. we have the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's very own Head of Innovation, Ken Webster, coming with us with the third of three bespoke interviews where he'll be discussing lots of themes that he's covered in his recent publication of the second edition of A Wealth of Flows. So look out in the schedule for that session titled A Flow of Wealth, or Wealth of Flows, again at 5 p.m. tomorrow. And also this Friday at 5 p.m, don't miss Charmaine Love, co-founder and co-chair of B Lab UK. She'll be coming into this live studio and she'll be discussing how B Corp is redefining business success and how more companies like Patagonia and even Ben & Jerry's are looking to redefine how they measure performance and success. And please do remember that if you've missed any session that you wanted to watch at the Diff, that you don't have to fear. All pre-recorded and recorded live content is available at thinkdiff.co and will be available for the remainder of the Diff and for catch-up afterwards. There's one that I wanted to highlight in the first week of the Diff, one of the first sessions in fact, Utopia or Dystopia, Driverless Futures and the Impact of Autonomy on Our Lives with the Royal College of Art's Dan Phillips is a good one to watch, so don't miss that. And you can watch it at your discretion. And finally, if you're on Twitter, one of these multinational companies that, you know, perhaps we'll be discussing about breaking up, but I won't get into that yet. Do follow us on our handle at thinkdiff_, and we post everything that we do at the Diff there. So if you follow us and you look and you find something that you like, jump on, watch a couple of sessions at the Diff, and be part of the conversation as well. Use the hashtag ThinkDiff, and you can post your questions to any and all of the speakers at the Diff, including Jonathan Taplin here today. Seb, back to you. Thanks for that, Leo. And I'd really highly recommend the first session that Leo mentioned there, which is Ken Webster's Wealth of Flows exclusive film we recorded for the Diff. There's two others in the series, one called A Good Disruption with Martin Stuchty and one called The Performance Economy by Walter Stihel. Definitely check those out. But we're back with Jonathan here, and I was just saying, Jonathan, before we had that little break there, that there is a bright side to this. And I also want to say that thank you so much to our audience members who have been sending in their questions. Again, using that hashtag ThinkDiff or in that comment space below the video stream. We're going to be feeding those through to Jonathan. I think one of them from Samantha perhaps touches on some of this bright side point. She asks, well, first she says, did you say that YouTube is not art? I don't know if this is, i.e. there's no art on YouTube. Surely that's at best subjective. And then she asked more specifically, how do we get the rules right to encourage innovation while avoiding the pitfalls you talk about? So I guess maybe a YouTube fan there.
So I don't mean to say there's no art on YouTube. I'm just saying that there's no great artist has emerged from YouTube that then went on to do other things that changed the culture. In other words, there's been no Francis Coppola, there's been no Stanley Kubrick, no John Schlesinger, you know, in the film world to emerge from that platform. And that is because I think the platform itself encourages kind of ephemera. It encourages, the biggest hits are stuff like PewDiePie, you know, a racist Nazi lover who plays video games. I don't think that's necessarily contributing to the culture. But look, let's talk about solutions, because it's one thing to paint a picture of a kind of dystopian reality here, and another thing to say, look, these things can change. I mean, I've seen it just in the terms of the way that the music business is resisting YouTube, and will eventually get a law passed that says, take down, stay down. In other words, when a musician doesn't want their content on YouTube, then they ought to be able to file a takedown notice and then make it YouTube's responsibility to keep it off the platform. That would in itself transform the music business, because so long as every piece of content in the world is out there for free on YouTube, people's ability to want or desire to want to go and buy it on Spotify or Apple Music is lowered. So, it's very hard to compete with free. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I think the European Union, which you guys are about to leave, is actually doing some pretty interesting things in terms of privacy. We talked about privacy, and in May of 2018, the EU is going to put in something called GDPR, which stands for General Data Privacy Regulation, which will, in its sense, flip the default on both Facebook and Google from opt-out to opt-in. In other words, today, when I sign up for Facebook, the implication is that I have given them permission to get every piece of data off me that they possibly can. If, in fact, Facebook had to ask for permission to get certain kinds of data from me, that would be a different business. And I think it would give us all a little bit more protection.
Is that a case of just policy and legislation catching up with the pace of change? Because I guess, as we've already discussed, this has happened extremely quickly. I mean, some of the ideas, the libertarian ideas, are a bit older, but the actual emergence of Facebook as a 2 billion user base has happened, in the last 10 years, I guess. Is there just a case of policymakers catching up a bit?
Yeah, I think quite honestly that what happened in the American election that we talked about earlier has been a kind of shock to people in general, and so, part of what we're trying to grapple with in the US, and I think in the UK as well, is that what we really realized, and even Sean Parker, who was the co-president of Facebook at the very beginning, said last week that he understood that the whole thing was built to addict you. I put a slide up right now, which has a book called Hooked: How to Build Habit-Forming Products, which is kind of the Bible of Silicon Valley application building. And the whole idea of it is that you create a feedback loop in such a way that people have to get addicted to using your phone. I mean, the average user checks their phone, who's in the millennial generation, about 240 times a day. So that kind of addiction can only be built in the same way that the poor mouse in the Skinner box, which is in this graphic I put up, clicks on the bar hoping for some food. Now, it doesn't get food every time, just like you don't get a like every time you post something. And so it keeps clicking the bar to wait till it gets the like, the food.
Sounds like me.
and so that kind of addictive behavior and what it's doing to our children, and the fact that Sean Parker himself said, "I'm worried," says to me, maybe we should be thinking about this.
Yeah, and I think that the couple of the things you brought up there linked to some of the questions we've had through. We had one from JP, who asked quite specifically about libertarianism or some of the ideas you were talking about earlier. He says, is the libertarianism of this tech elite a consequence of how things have turned out for them, or is it central to how they came to power? Is it a chicken or egg situation, he even asks?
I think it's central to how they came to power. I think that's a really good question, because essentially, if the political class hadn't bought into this idea that a business sector with no regulation should and could exist, then these companies would have never grown to the size that they grew. I mean, you remember that chart I put up before, which literally 10 years ago, none of them were in the top 5 companies in the world. And today, they dominate the top 5 companies in the world. So this is an extraordinarily rapid event. And it came about because they lived in a world of no regulation, which is, of course, why when they are shocked, like Sheryl Sandberg was 3 weeks ago, that people are using their advertising systems to target anti-Semitic viewers, you wonder, what were you thinking about? You built this and you don't think people might use it for nefarious reasons? I mean, it's insane.
And we've had a question in from AB Designs as the handle's name, and they ask, I'll read the question out. Just because the current generation is passing through a digital phase, can this be termed a curse because of digital firms? Can the newer technologies overshadow current trends soon enough? And they make reference to the fact that so much has changed just between 2000 and 2016. And I might tack onto that question. In your view, what sort of things are giving you hope of optimism? What kind of trends do you see that could replace this current sort of path that appears?
Well, let's just take the possibility that these companies might be forced to break themselves up into smaller pieces and compete. So let's say that Facebook had to sell Instagram and WhatsApp. And so there were now 3 big social networks, each with 1 billion people on them competing. Let's say that Google had to sell YouTube. And so Google was competing against YouTube. So now there were more players.
Just to be clear, you see that as that mechanism, hypothetical mechanism, I guess, would have to be a policy, like a legal, legislative mechanism.
No, that would be an antitrust case.
Yeah.
In other words, just like we decided in 1906 that Standard Oil was too big.
Yeah.
And so we broke it into many small Standard Oils. There are plenty of precedent for it. In the United States, even in the 70s, we broke AT&T, which was the legacy monopoly phone company, into 8 companies. So there are plenty of precedent for this kind of action. It's just that the people who enforce antitrust haven't been willing to do that for a long time. So look, this notion that, things are moving so fast, so why do we worry about Google's power? Because, Yahoo was the search giant 15 years ago. Well, I would argue that that's a false notion. If you think about it, if I came to you or any of you people who are viewing this and said, hey, I want to do a startup to take on Google in the search advertising business, do you think anybody would invest in that? I don't think so. I think it would be a joke. So I don't have any hope that the market will come to a solution to this problem. I don't think Google will be replaced. I don't think Facebook will be replaced. And I certainly don't think Amazon will be replaced. What the founders of Facebook, Google, and Amazon understood was that the internet is a winner-takes-all business because what we call the network effect. There's something called Metcalfe's law. So the value of a network is equal to the square of the number of users. When you have a social network that has 2 billion users, why would I want to create another one? As the poor people in Snapchat have found out. So I don't think that there's going to be some market solution to it. I actually think that the only solution is government intervention and regulation.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I mean, thank you, John.
Just one last thing. Al Franken, who was an important senator in the United States, gave a speech last week and wrote an op-ed in The Guardian, which I highly recommend to everybody. And basically he said, we should use net neutrality regulation to regulate these companies. In other words, Google can't be in the business of being the search engine and also in the business of pushing its own services, whether they're around product selection, travel, restaurant bookings, whatever. It can't do both because it always advantages its own services over those of other competitors. And that's why the European Union fined them $2.7 billion a couple of months ago. And I don't think without some kind of force, they're not going to change their behavior.
Thanks for that, Jonathan. I think we could keep talking about this for quite a bit longer, but and I thank so much to our audience for the number of questions we had in. I did want to ask you one final question, and I wondered, so we talked a lot about some of the challenges there, and we talked a little bit about some of the sources of optimism. What's your optimism level as someone who's delved into this deeply and come on the fascinating journey that you've come on into this issue?
My optimism is fairly high. When I first published this book, there was a lot of skepticism in the community about whether anything would change in this fact. In fact, my English publisher, Macmillan, asked me to take the subtitle, which said, the subtitle of the book was How Facebook, Google, and Amazon Cornered Culture and Undermined Democracy. And they suggested, well, you should take that undermined democracy thing out of there because there's no proof of that. Well, now there is. There's plenty of proof. And of course, they're going to put that back on for the paperback version that's going to come out in a few months. So I think we've moved a long way. The very fact that a bunch of politicians realized that these companies could influence an election has changed the dialogue. If there were more level playing field, because after all, antitrust is really about letting people compete. And if there was a more level playing field, then I think all sorts of wonderful things could happen. I mean, I see in the music business, the rise of the streaming music business is really helping musicians. And if we could get YouTube out of the picture, it could really help musicians.
Great. Thank you so much for your time today, Jonathan, and for sharing your story with us, and obviously encourage people to delve a bit deeper into the ideas and into the book itself, and to continue to join the discussion. And to our fantastic audience, thank you so much for your questions today and for your input and comments. Sorry that I didn't get to all of them, but hopefully I answered enough of them to get the conversation flowing. My big takeaway from today is that maybe artificial intelligence and things like surveillance capitalism, they come in a form that perhaps we don't necessarily expect. They might come through algorithms and less obviously sexy things like robots. So that's something that's fascinating as part of our broader discussion of the age of automation. I do really encourage you to use that hashtag #ThinkDiff, and to use our comment spaces on our session pages to offer your contributions and your questions. And we look forward to seeing you again at thinkdiff.co.
Hey, Seb.
Yes,
Seb,
Jonathan.
Can I say one last thing?
Yes, okay.
I'm going to be at University College London on the evening of November 27th, if anyone wants to come and talk.
One last shout out for Jonathan's event at UCL.
Okay.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Okay. Bye.